From In the Beginning to the Musical Apocalypse, this is The Bible Says What. I'm your host, Mike Wiseman. The Bible is a collection of altered and repurposed myths. The stories found in the Christian Holy Book can be traced back to a more primitive way of thinking. Today, I'm going to read a passage from Man, God, and Immortality. This book is a collection of passages from the late great Scottish anthropologist and folklorist, Sir James G. Fraser. He is one of my favorite authors on comparative religion. Chapter 4, page 355, The Fall of Man. Arguing from the analogy of the moon or of animals which cast their skins, the primitive philosopher has inferred that in the beginning a perpetual renewal of youth was either appointed by a benevolent being for the human species or was actually enjoyed by them, and that but for a crime, an accident, or a blunder, it would have been enjoyed by them forever. People who pin their faith in immortality to the calfskins of serpents, lizards, beetles, and the like naturally look on these animals as the hated rivals who have robbed us of the heritage which God or nature intended that we should possess. Consequently, they tell stories to explain how it came about that such low creatures contrived to oust us from this priceless possession. Tales of this sort are widely diffused throughout the world, and it would be no matter for surprise to find them among the Semites. The story of the fall of man in the 3rd chapter of Genesis appears to be an abridged version of this savage myth. Little is wanted to complete its resemblance to the similar myths still told by native peoples in many parts of the world. The principal, almost the only, omission is the silence of the narrator as to the eating of the fruit of the tree of life by the serpent, and the consequent attainment of immortality by the reptile. Nor is it difficult to account for the lacuna, the vein of rationalism which runs through the Hebrew account of creation and has stripped it of many grotesque features that adorn or disfigure the corresponding Babylonian tradition, could hardly fail to find a stumbling block in the alleged immortality of serpents. And the redactor of the story in its final form has removed this stone of offense from the path of the faithful by simple process of blotting out the incident entirely from the legend. Yet the yawning gap left by this sponge has not escaped the commentators, who look in vain for the part which should have been played in the narrative by the tree of life. If my interpretation of the story is right, it has been left for the comparative method, after thousands of years, to supply the blank in the ancient canvas, and to restore, in all their primitive crudity, the barbaric colors which the skillful hand of the Hebrew artist had softened or effaced. Let's start the show.
Is there anything in the Bible that you yourself have an issue with? Okay, so it took you reading the Bible to realize that those things were bad for you?
Yeah, it actually did. I
didn't figure this out on your own?
No, Ted Bundy could be redeemed. God doesn't kill children.
What do you think the Passover was? Yahweh sets up a whole system in the Old Testament where you slaughter animals just so he's able to forgive you.
Today's special guest is the founder of 10,000 Fathers Worship School. Welcome to the show, Aaron Keyes.
Thanks, Mike. Good to be here.
Awesome to have you, man. Appreciate you taking the time and talking with me.
Love it.
So what brought you to this point? What made you say, I'm going to start a worship school?
It was basically the number of pastors and churches that I was hearing from who said they needed worship pastors, because a lot of churches and a lot of pastors that I talked to said, look, we've got good singers and we've got good bands. We don't have anyone who knows how to shepherd us in growing in our worship. They were saying, we want to worship, we want to praise, we want to go deeper, but we don't know how to get there. Do you know anyone? And so just out of the demand, really, we said, well, let's do something. And I had done internships over the years where I have guys, like, we get together and talk about a book, for a summer. But it was like, we've got to figure out how to move from internship to discipleship, because the internship ain't cutting it. That's kind of why we did it.
So what do you mean internship to discipleship?
Internship is like mentorship. It's like, come meet with me. But discipleship is come follow me. And so that's why we had to open up our calendar a lot more than once a week coffee. Like we actually had to open up our life so that people could come and see, here's what real life looks like, from songwriting to traveling and leading worship to staff meeting at church to a Sunday morning at church to going to the hospital and praying for someone from the church. So we literally would have people live with us for a year at a time. For the first few years of worship school, it was just come live in our house. My wife and I have 4 sons, and we'd have 4 guys living with us at any given point who were all worship leaders. And it was this kind of neo-monastic, neo-spastic kind of thing that was happening. And it was wonderful, though, because we just kind of stumbled our way into the way of Jesus, and having people in your life close enough to the real thing. And you live in such a way that you earn the right to speak into their real thing. It's family. And so that was how it started. But really quickly we realized after about 3 or 4 years, we realized we're going to have to open this up to a different model than just a residency, because a lot of people aren't 21 and single, but they are leading worship and they need to be trained and they never have. And, that we're at such a unique point in church history that's never existed before, where just because someone can lead musically, we then think they should lead spiritually. That's never happened in the history of the church until our generation. And it's nowhere in the Bible, obviously. The qualifications for leadership in the church haven't changed. It looks a lot like, a godly, gifted pastor. But we've really moved the goalposts for worship pastors and worship leaders and basically hired them out of musical proficiency. And then, of course, we always fire them for character deficiency. So the same stuff that senior pastors have had to be trained in over the years, formation, interpretation, hermeneutics, homiletics, communication, culture, philosophy, all these kinds of things, worship leaders haven't had to do any of that. But worship leaders, for the first time in history, at the same time as they haven't had to be trained, they've also been given as much influence and as much time in the gathered assembly as the senior pastor who has a doctorate, So you've got like such a crazy thing happening right now that's never happened before, where you could have someone with 50 years of experience leading ministry and a doctorate who has just as much influence in their community as a 22-year-old kid who looks good in skinny jeans and doesn't know his way through the Bible at all.
But he's got a good voice.
And he's got a good voice, and that has never happened until this generation. And that's what we're trying to address.
Interesting. So, so you're training them up to not only just be worship leaders, but pastors as well. Are you training them to handle any kind of certain circumstances and situations with congregation,
Yeah, we try to. I mean, we're basically now we are literally accredited as a third of a master's degree from a couple of different schools, because seminaries and divinity schools are recognizing the role of a worship leader. Even though it's new, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, there was no such thing until about 50 years ago. And so, schools, we're in partnership with Northern Seminary now. We have been for about 5 years. We've got more partnerships coming online next year, and divinity schools and seminaries are going, this is the serious role of leadership in today's church, and who's training these people? No one is the answer. YouTube is the answer, to be more precise. And that's a pretty terrible school. Yeah. Pretty bad school.
Yeah.
So we're trying to just walk alongside leaders who, man, a lot of these, I'd say most, if not almost all of these worship leaders have incredible hearts. They're not ego driven, they're not cocky. They don't have these ambitions to be a big superstar. They actually want to help their church worship. They just are alone. They're isolated. They are unprepared. Like they've never been given tools. And see what's happening all around them in the worship world, where the competency keeps going higher and higher, but the character seems to be going lower and lower. And people are just they're either getting fired, they're quitting, they're giving up. And it's disheartening. These leaders start with a desire to help people worship God. Like, I think it's such a gift to get to spend any time of my week helping people worship God. I think like when worship goes right, everything goes right. When worship goes wrong, everything goes wrong. And we get to help people that's like work that matters for people who care. We get to do that, but we have been less trained to do that than plumbers have been trained to replace a toilet, which is crazy. So we've got to change that.
Yeah, well, that's where you guys come in. That's pretty interesting. It's quite a thing you're doing there. What is worship to you?
What a good question. Wow. I don't want to give you like this churchy answer. I know all the Hebrew word. I know the Greek word of worship and all this stuff. To me, worship is about loving God. It's about the greatest commandment, which is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, love your neighbor as yourself. To me, that's worship. We only started conflating worship with singing recently, but in the Bible, there's all these different words for worship, all these different expressions of worship. But if you go on Google and look up worship, you see, exactly what you expect. It looks like a rock show. That's not the case in the Bible. Like, worship is an offering. It's a sacrifice. It's giving yourself. To me, all of that is it's summed up in the word love. But even when we use a word like love, gets hijacked by The Bachelorette and Hallmark and all this other stuff.
Well, didn't David sing and dance?
Yeah, but David was a priest. David was a king. And for sure, there's a musical and a performance aspect of it. But way before there was singing and dancing, there were altars and there were sacrifices.
Well, at the same time, too, yeah. Yeah, at the same time they were singing and dancing, he still required the bloodshed.
Yeah, well, in Genesis, there's one mention of music in Genesis, and it's Genesis chapter 4. It's Jubal, this descendant of Cain, who invents instruments. But in the first song in worship doesn't come in until Exodus 15. This is a lot of time has passed with the Song of Moses. But there's tons of worship going on in the book of Genesis. There's just not bands yet. There's altars everywhere. So anytime a sacrifice is being made, so worship, as we understand it today, it's it's not a very costly sacrifice, but it costs a little bit of time. It costs some of our attention, maybe it costs some of our comfort to actually get down on our knees or to raise our hands. So there are little costs to what we associate as corporate worship today and modern worship today. But we're just trying to say, man, that the worship that God's looking for is so much bigger than that. And it's so much bigger than what happens in this one little moment of your week. We want to actually help people worship the other 167 hours, not just that one. So worship should be all of your life, live to the glory of God, but we just all screw that up sometimes and live to our own glory, or we don't really want to give. We want to take, we want to receive. So love is, I just think love is the best thing to look at. And specifically, marital love, where infatuation is a wonderful stage of romance, but it's only a stage. And my wife and I celebrated our 20th anniversary this summer, and our relationship looks really different than it did when we were engaged. Looks different than it did before we had kids. We have 4 kids now. We've got so much more than infatuation and ecstasy. When, the beginning of love, where most rom-coms, and who cares about 20 years into the marriage? Show us how it kicks off, because that's where all the sparks are really flying, right? And basically that's what's gotten, that's been kind of transfused as paramount for what ecstatic worship needs to look like, is the moment of kind of bliss and ecstasy and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not against any of that. I just think it's not that it's inaccurate. It's just wholly inadequate, because we are 20 years into marriage, and I can't wait to see how it looks different 20 years from now. We're celebrating 40 years. But I just know if I judged my marriage on the level of intense ecstasy that I'm feeling when I see my wife, it's different than it would be 20 years ago. We've got so much more than that. We've got some history. We've got faithfulness. We've got forgiveness. We've worked through some stuff. We've changed. We've got transformation. All this stuff to me is how I think of when I think about worship. I want to help 16-year-olds love God like a 16-year-old, but I don't want to ask 60-year-olds to worship like I would a 16-year-old. They're in very different stages. I wouldn't ask a 60-year-old married couple to act like a 16-year-old dating couple. So trying to dignify the different generational kind of, evolution of love and how that affects worship, that's all really interesting to me. And I want to, when I lead people, I want to honor the people who are way past the puppy love stage of Jesus and don't really care to sing, I want to nibble on your ear for 2 hours to Jesus. Like, I outgrew that a long time ago.
Oh, man. That's the title of the episode right there.
Well, you're welcome. But
oh, man,
really,
that's funny.
Their generations they've been following Jesus and serving sacrificially for longer than a lot of these young guys have been alive. And what's scary is some of these young guys, because they haven't been trained, they don't have historic panorama perspective. They go in there and they start leading with their cool new song that you can't tell if it's a song for their girlfriend or for Jesus. And the 65-year-olds are not too interested in it. And the 22-year-old is going, you guys just don't get it. Y'all just don't get it.
What kind of songs do the 65-year-olds like?
Good songs. It's not
to who,
just
though?
that. I don't think people have a problem with new songs. I think they have a problem with new songs, but their actual problem is they have a problem with bad songs. And most of the new songs are bad songs. So think about the Wesleys or Isaac Watts or Martin Luther or Fanny Crosby. Like, they wrote songs that have lasted a couple hundred years. Beat on My Vision has lasted over 1,000 years. Like, songs don't stand up the test of time and thousands and thousands of listenings and singings if they're not really solidly built songs. And those guys, like, let's take the Wesleys. They wrote 7,500 songs. They lived sacrificially on mission for 20 years, horseback revivals, trying to evangelize an illiterate Europe. So they're writing all kinds of doctrine and theology into their songs so that people could remember the stories, because they weren't able to read the Bible. So these guys, they live radically, faithfully, sacrificially, and they write songs out of that kind of depth. Those songs have a serious staying power. The problem happens when young guys go to Starbucks and they book a writing session and they work at it for 2 hours and they think that what they came up with is going to stick around and have that same staying power as these guys who live radically, sacrificially, faithfully for decades. The songs come out of the songwriter. Art is an expression of the artist. Like, your life is your songs are going to go deeper than your life, or your thought process. But again, because most worship leaders haven't been to seminary, haven't had to go to Sunday school, haven't done apprenticeship, haven't had to walk through the fire necessarily, and no one in America really is living at that kind of level of intensity and radical missional, dedication, as was going on with those guys who wrote those songs. We forget those guys' lives and their legacy, and we just remember their songs, and then we expect, like, our songs, without the life and without the legacy and without the faithfulness and without the sacrifice, we expect our song to be able to hang with those songs? Like, no chance. So back to your original question, what kind of songs do 65-year-olds like? They like good songs, not just old songs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just because a song's good or bad doesn't mean it's not going to stick around, unfortunately. I mean, we've got plenty of that from the 80s, still sticking around.
But but that's only 40 years old, man. We're talking hundreds.
True. You had mentioned that in the Old Testament, the sacrifices of these animals, the killing of these animals, was a way to worship Yahweh. Is that really what you believe? Like killing these animals and slaughtering these animals was a way to worship?
That's a great question, man.
That's such a weird thing to think about.
Yeah, I think, man, we can't project like 21st century sensibility on, history from 5,000 years ago or whatever. This was the best that they knew. And we're all products of our culture. So if you had grown up, if you or I grew up today and everyone around us and everyone that we knew they thought sacrificing an animal honored God, you probably would too, and I probably would too. So I don't think that God is really that honored if you go out and kill a lamb. No. I don't think that was ever what God really wanted. God wanted intimacy and relationship. But we just really give ourselves a bit of the doubt and think that sin's not that big of a deal or whatever. And these were kind of the symbols that were visceral, visual. You can't miss this. This is what sin does to the world. Look at this animal. This animal didn't deserve this, or whatever else.
But he required it, though. He required these sacrifices and this blood. Hebrews 9:22, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. This is his rules. This is what he set in motion. He wanted things to go this way. He could have done it any other way. Flowers, letter, just send me a letter, or say you're sorry. There's a million different ways he could have done it, but this is the way he chose. And you're telling me that and it even states in, where was it? Leviticus 17, I believe it was, that the blood was made specifically for this purpose, so that he would be able to forgive sins through the spilling of it.
Yeah, so, that's what they thought. That's the best they had. I don't agree at all. I mean, I don't. If you can forgive your wife without killing your cat, then we really need to think about, like, is that right? Like, does that actually make sense?
No, it doesn't.
And no, it doesn't make sense. Of course, God can forgive. God forgave way before anyone ever shed blood. Like, he just forgives. And we find it so impossible to believe that God could be better than us. But that's crazy.
Well, maybe
if I can forgive. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
If he wanted to show that he was better, he would say, hey, look, stop killing these animals to me. Please, just let's have a relationship. Hey, hi, I'm God. Let's talk. How was your day? No, instead, Yahweh's like, yeah, keep killing those animals to me. And even in some, he demands it, and he gets upset if he doesn't have it. That's what the whole Passover thing was they were in slavery and they weren't allowed to sacrifice animals to him. So he got upset. I mean, it's
but
very important
think about, like, sometimes we conflate, and it's transference and it's conflation. When we think of, punitive measure. And this is where when you get into atonement and stuff, it gets really crazy what people believe. And worship leaders are kind of the worst about spreading awful thoughts about God. But there was nothing, they weren't punishing that lamb, at Passover. Something had to die because this is what we're doing to the world. We're bringing death into the world. And
by slaughtering the animal. That's where the death is coming from. You're literally bringing it into the world by killing the animal. So you stop doing that, and then you won't have the death, right?
Yeah, but it's interesting because one of my favorite verses in the Bible, actually, it's this really little aside, and it's in Genesis 5, talking about Enoch, and it says something to the effect of, after Enoch became a father, he walked with God for 300 years. Okay, so this is pre-everything, I mean, this is way early in it. And there's obviously, Jesus hadn't come around yet. There's no 10 Commandments. There's no law. There's nothing. It's just Enoch walked with God for 300 years.
Wow.
I think that's
one
of the most fascinating verses in the Bible. I know. What did they do? How did that work? But obviously, there's no blood sacrifice involved there. Like, that's not what God's looking for us to walk with him. But we
come on down and
away.
walk with us. Why doesn't he come down and walk with us then? I mean, if that's the end goal, he wants to have a relationship. Show up. Come on.
Yeah,
Here
would
we
be
are.
nice.
That would be
That
great.
would be nice.
That would really help things out as far as the belief factor.
It might just dispel the need for it, though.
No, I still believe, because then he's there. I believe now. That dispels the whole need for the wishful thinking as faith. I don't need to wishfully think that he's there. Oh, he's there.
Yeah.
No faith
you got
required.
A good point. Sure. Yeah. Well, I just don't think God was never after sacrifice. God wants life. God makes life. Sin brings death. Like, we bring death. But I don't think we would ever really grasp how serious things were until we had to look at it right in front of us, not conceptually or mentally, but visually, viscerally. Like, this blood, this is the only way we're ever going to be delivered. I absolutely reject any idea of blood being required for forgiveness. That's so ridiculous to me. It's disgusting what that says about God.
Absolutely.
But I can see, and this goes with the Passover thing, this is the only way we're ever going to be delivered. Otherwise, we're never going to realize God. Like we've got to have certain stuff like scared out of us. I think like this is what you're going to do. This is the end result. I mean, it's Plato predicted it, right? Like if a perfect man comes, we'll kill him. That's exactly what we did. This is what we will do to the world.
I beg to differ that he was perfect.
Oh, okay.
I mean, what makes him so perfect? I mean, he went into he cursed a tree that was out of season, got mad at it because it didn't have fruit. The tree died. He's going to come back at the end of days and burn up all the non-believers and send them to hell with his angel army.
It's a hop, skip, and jump from the tree to what you just said there.
Well, those are bad things that he's done, that he's going to do. He also made, marrying a divorced woman adulterous, which, that comes with a death penalty right off the bat. So there's things that he did that aren't perfect. I mean, let's just focus on the tree part. If I am a perfect being and I see a tree and I want an apple out of it, but it doesn't have any apples because it's not apple season, and I get mad at it, I've reacted uncontrollably angry at it. That's not really perfect, and it killed it because it's not even its season. That's just kind of weird right off the bat.
Yeah, I hear you.
So I mean, why do you coming back to kill non-believers or people that don't love Yahweh? There's another one there that just doesn't. And then of course the divorce. I mean, these are things that he's done as well.
Well, killing non-believers, I mean, I know that there are certain groups of Christians that think that kind of stuff. And what you just said about what he's going to do at the end, there are groups of Christians who think that too. It's
right,
just
well, it's
that
in the Bible. That's what the Bible says.
Well, but I mean, there's a world between what it says and how we hear it, and how we understand it.
Okay.
Right. So, I mean, if I can miscommunicate to my wife, who I love, who I'm married to, like the words coming out of my mouth are heard differently in her ears than what I meant, then you can bet that we're going to misunderstand. I mean, thousands of years ago in languages we didn't speak to cultures that we've never lived in. So we're definitely going to miss. There's going to be lots of communication breakdown. I mean, this is why we need to be very careful when we interpret the Bible, and, back to like the perfect thing, when the Apostle Paul, who was one of the a brilliant thinker, just in terms of world history, a brilliant mind, when he was with these guys in Corinth, and in 1 Corinthians 2, he said, the only thing I needed to know when I was with you was Christ. Which Christ? The Christ cursing the fig tree? The Christ driving out animals with a whip? And he goes, no, Christ crucified. That's all I need to know, because that shows me right there all I need to know.
Wow.
Of what God is like. And it's not what everyone thought. What everyone thought God would be like if he came is lightning bolts in one hand, judgment in the other. It's what I look at every ancient temple, what the statues of their gods look like. Jesus just comes and goes, no, there's not lightning bolts and judgment and finger pointing. There's open arms. There's mercy. There's forgiveness. This is what God is actually like. And Hebrews 1 says, God spoke in lots of different ways, lots of different messages over the years. But in these last days, here's how God spoke. He made it undeniably clear. This is what I am like. Jesus isn't disguising God or making it tricky to see. He's finally clarifying. This is what God's always been like. And if he's the same yesterday, today, and forever, then that means all that stuff that they thought God was doing in the Old Testament couldn't have been God. Wow. That's a reflection of their culture.
So how do you, in order to get that, you have to leave out a lot of Jesus stuff as well. How do you decipher which parts are not accurate or mistranslations? How do you decipher that?
The cross becomes the ultimate hermeneutical key, and unless we can understand something through the cross, then we don't understand it yet. Or if we come to an understanding of God that is incongruent with what we see on the cross, then we need to keep working. And in the same way, you have to look below the surface of the cross to get to this. On the surface, the cross is awful. It's a lynching of an innocent man. It's a beating of a victim. It's
Pointlessly.
torture on the surface.
Yeah,
On the surface, it's politically driven. It's religiously, conjured. There's all kinds of stuff on the surface, but it's what's going on under the surface where you really see, wow, now I see like what God was doing. Now we see.
Well, you're starting with a premise. You're starting with the cross, and that's where you're going to focus all of your attention on and build from there. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you're already got a predetermined idea of what your Jesus is, and anything else you find in the Bible doesn't fit that is automatically, it's got to be wrong, it's got to be misinterpreted wrong, or it didn't mean to be in there, stuff like that. Am I correct?
Or there's stuff to it that I'm not saying I understand all of it.
Yeah,
but I'm saying the same thing that Paul did. Like, there's lots I don't understand. One thing I do, and this trumps everything else. And I don't want to let the obscurity of some weird verse or some side sermon kind of topic. I don't want any of that to trump the clarity and the centrality of what was at the center for Paul, and that's Christ crucified. That's the one. So. Not that all that stuff was wrong, but it was the best that they could do at that time, and it was what they thought God was like. But then Jesus showed us what He actually is.
Well, Luke 14:26, Jesus says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, his wife and children, his brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Do you believe this is something Jesus said?
Yeah, but that's the thing. I mean, that's figure of speech, right? Like. We there's so many phrases in other languages that mean nothing to us, or we would think, wow, that's offensive, this obviously Jesus doesn't hate his mother and father. He just has to use strong language to wake. Well, because Jesus is the epitome of love. I mean, he's the most. The reason that I feel comfortable starting with the assumption that I do is because the way that Jesus lived and just the way He lived, to me, is the most beautiful life anyone's ever lived, as far as inclusion and kindness and mercy, but also powerful rebuke when systems were manipulative or exploitative, these kinds of things. Like, the way that He lived was the most beautiful life. And so the way that He died, like, I think for so long in church, we've just focused on the death of Jesus, and we've really missed the way of Jesus, the way He lived. And we've even sung and celebrated for His death and His resurrection, which is great. But we've really missed, actually, we're not just supposed to applaud Him. We're supposed to imitate Him and follow Him and live like Him. And
curse that apple tree.
Yeah, I mean, if that was what Paul said, I vow to know Christ that cursed the apple tree, then maybe I go with you. But I think that is any of the parables, any of the teachings that Jesus gives, like you can't miss the main point for something else He's saying or doing to illustrate that point. So, because Jesus obviously told some pretty brutal parables about a guy who was forgiven by one guy and then was unforgiving towards someone else regarding like fiscal debt. And, so the guy gets brought back in and he's going to be tortured or killed. I don't remember. It was pretty drastic. But it's a parable where the point is, guys, forgive people. You've been forgiven, to forgive. And the way that He tells that story to illustrate that point, you can't miss like the main point. Usually like parables, the parabolic actions, like that cursing of the fig tree, they're trying to communicate something evocative and important, and to do that they'll use evocative language, explosive imagery, but
what was important on that?
Man, I don't remember. I don't have it like right in front of me. I haven't thought about that in 10 years. I just know it, like most of the other parabolic stories Jesus tells, or actions that Jesus performs. It's to communicate something, and this is the best way He could figure to communicate this in a way that we receive it. Wow. So you have to be careful not to miss the main point of something Jesus does or says for the way that He says it. It's like,
man, I think
like missing the gift for the wrapping.
I can think of better ways to communicate than through a book with a bunch of contradictions and hyperbole and mistakes and inaccuracies and misquotes. You could probably write down maybe you can find
so
out.
Endearing to me.
Well, that way you don't know if it's true though. It's like it's so it's hard to believe. So maybe if he wrote down something himself, that would be a start. Second, if he made this one thing he wrote down be able to last through the times, regardless, and be relevant in each century for moving forward, and of course make it last, like I said, undestroyable, undestructible, whatever, that would be something. But what he did was he chose. I don't know. What did he choose?
Weakness.
Did he even choose this? Or did just people around him just start writing it? And he didn't tell. Did he tell them to write this down? Did Jesus himself say, "Hey, write down my adventures"?
There's only a couple times in the Bible where God says to write something down. I don't know that Jesus ever did that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and
interesting.
It's crazy,
so they just did it on their own.
Well, I think you bring up a really good point that I never hear anyone talk about, and that's like the earliest gospel was written like 30 years after the death of Jesus, 40 years. And so when people get real into the nitty gritty of like particular language that Jesus used, or they break down this sentence and they really geek out, and I'm like, man, I can't remember stuff that I heard like yesterday. And I get that they'd never heard anyone talk like this, or they'd never seen anyone live like this. They were particularly attuned. And I get that there's the oral culture and all that kind of stuff. But there's no way that 30 years later, what they said Jesus said was verbatim. They don't care. They're trying to get the main points of it,
How do you know they got those right, though?
Well, because it's pretty incredible, like the way that all the different manuscripts discovered around the world, and of course there are no extant like original documents, but it's pretty incredible when they find Dead Sea Scrolls, 60 years ago, that have been buried in caves for however long, over 1,000 years, that they're almost verbatim to the original stuff that they found from Psalms and Isaiah and Deuteronomy. Like it's pretty wild how consistent the Bible was. Not saying it's like flawless or perfect or anything. I think that is a crock. The whole inerrancy thing, what a joke.
Interesting.
But the fact that the Bible is so, all those different documents, they actually worked really well together, and they fit really well together. That's pretty hard to explain, except for God doing something kind of supernatural, if you ask me.
Interesting. Kind of like when we find older stories that resemble the Bible stories, like the Gilgamesh and the Noah tale, stuff like that, which proves that these stories were just passed down, and that's all they were.
Yeah, well, and in an oral culture, again, like story
people
is
love stories,
powerful.
Man. Yeah.
Well, it's not just that people love them. It's like, it's how you communicate truth. And we miss the point when we're like, was this true? Like, is the tortoise and the hare a true story?
Is Gilgamesh a true
what
story?
A stupid question. Yeah. Are a lot of these true? Like, who cares? What's it saying? What's tortoise and the hare saying? Well, it's a story that illustrates something that's a lesson that we need to learn. I think sometimes we just miss the forest of the trees when it comes to a lot of stuff in Scripture.
It's a story. Yeah, and I agree with you. That's what a lot of these Old Testament stuff is, just stories. It's these people trying to figure out the world. And this is the best they came up with. And that's what it looks like to me, is a bunch of men put it together and trying to figure out the world. So...
yeah,
stories. Yeah, just a bunch of stories. I like that. Just a collection of stories. But I want to get back a little bit to sin itself. Where did sin come from? Who brought sin in? And like, what is it specifically? Like, is it a tangible item? Is it something we can see? Is it just is it a virus? Explain sin.
Oh gosh! Oh, I am so out of my depth. I love it. This is fantastic. Holy cow! It's the beginning is that Genesis 1, 2, 3 stuff.
So you believe that
there's two trees? Well, no. Let me.
Okay.
Again, let me. I probably don't believe it like you want me to, or whatever. But Genesis 1 through 11, man, like, I don't know. I think this is pretty incredible, like, narrative, maybe even parabolic kind of narrative to help us understand where stuff came from. But as soon as there are, in the story, there's two trees, you know what's about to go down. Like, as soon as there's one that you can't eat from and one that you can't, you know where the story's going. And so sin is like, it's a result of our freedom. Like, we have to be free. If we are to love God, really, truly, then we have to choose that freely. And we have to be free to choose otherwise. If we are going to actually love God, we have to be free to do otherwise. And I think sin is what happens when we choose otherwise.
So Yahweh created everything. Did he create sin, or is that just a result of some other things that he put together that created sin?
Yeah, I mean, that's philosophical, I guess. I haven't taken philosophy in 25 years, but I think it's a result of a value that he has, which is freedom and love over control, and automatons. That's how C.S. Lewis talks about it. Like, God doesn't want automatons. He actually wants people in real relationship. So I don't think God creates sin, but God creates a world where a lot of things are possible that God does not want, and he permits it.
Why? Why would he permit things he doesn't want? Why would he even create something he doesn't want? Why would he create death and destruction and sin, or the possibility of sin? That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Well, maybe love is worth it. Maybe it's like that Japanese pottery. Have you seen that Katsugi pottery, where, you know what I'm talking about, where they'll break the pottery and they'll stitch it, they'll put it back together, but instead of glue, they'll use gold, and they'll actually highlight the brokenness of something. They'll restore it, but they'll make it's actually more beautiful than it was when it was unbroken. Like, I wonder if that's part of it. Like, God's more interested in redemption than prevention. He knows, like, things can be even more beautiful if they've been broken.
Ouch,
I mean, look at his own body.
Yeah. You know what? Come on. Okay, let's back up. You just said, look at his own body. What?
Yeah,
How does that work? First off, I can't see it. Second off, how do you know it got more pretty after it got broken?
Well, not that it's, I don't mean pretty. I mean
more attractive,
glorious.
more glory. Well, okay, that's if you put gold in. I mean, there are things that, yes, you can take them apart and put them back together and make them better once you've taken them apart and whatnot. But these are human beings, man. To take us apart in the first place is where I have an issue. I mean, if you're going to send me pain, suffering, and trials and tribulations, man, that doesn't show me love. That shows me that you.
Yeah, I don't ever think God's the one bringing trials and tribulation. It's funny. People will sing. This goes back to worship. Like, a huge worship song from about 10 years ago said, "You give and take away. You give and take away. My heart will choose to say, blessed be your name." And that's straight out of the book of Job. But Job was wrong. Like, it was dead wrong. God never took one thing away from Job in that story. Satan took everything.
He allowed Satan to.
Yeah, but who's
responsible for Satan?
Well, Satan is. There's actual freedom. Like, Satan actually has some permission in this world.
Well, Yahweh gave him that permission, especially in the story of Job. And then in the end of it, Yahweh says, "You caused me to destroy a man without any reason." He tricked Yahweh. Satan ended up tricking Yahweh into doing all of this stuff, and he even admitted it in Job. Why would a loving God allow his arch nemesis to destroy someone's family? And if you're telling me it's because he's going to be broken and made better in the end, well, what about his family? What about all the animals he killed? I mean, these people had feelings and a life they wanted to live as well. But Yahweh's like, no, I'm going to teach Job a lesson. Screw these guys.
I don't think Yahweh's trying to teach Job a lesson. I think he's teaching Satan one. And again, that might be the oldest part of Scripture ever written. So again, tortoise and the hare. Like, this is one of the masterful pieces of philosophy in ancient literature. We're still talking about it. So I think, like, we have to look for the main the main thrust of the story, and not get too hung up on what kind of God would do this. Because any God that we're going to say, well, God must be like this, again, that is obscure, and that is shadowy. Jesus on the cross is clear and unmistakably on the side of life, on the side of mercy, on the side of forgiveness. So,
well, yeah, if you cut out all the other stuff, of course. I mean, that's what you're focusing on, you know. I mean, if you're getting rid of the rest of the Bible, Yahweh's this great person, and you've just focused in on this one part, and nothing else that doesn't fit it won't work for you. Like, do you believe the flood happened? Do you believe the Passover happened?
Well, most religions have a version of the flood, you know.
A local flood, most likely, yes.
Right, yeah. But I mean, how are they supposed to know all those thousands of years ago, you know, what's global and what's local? I mean, those are tribal people.
Right, that was their whole world, you know. For them, when their world went underwater, that was their was their home. I mean, that was their whole world. So, I mean, and then if we're gonna point to the oldest one, let's go with Gilgamesh. Then that's the true one, and Noah's Ark is the one that copied off of that one essentially. So then Gilgamesh is the real story.
Maybe, man. I don't know. I mean, there are interesting opinions out there about. Goodness, we are so far out of my depth. But there are interesting opinions out there.
You're doing great, man. I appreciate it.
About the Nephilim. You know, there's this interesting stuff in Genesis 5 and 6 about these Nephilim that seem to be like darkness, sin, Satan, like really wreaking havoc on the world. And, you know, is Noah... Is God saving Noah? God saving humanity, not God eradicating humanity, but actually eradicating these Nephilim beings and saving humanity. I know that makes me sound like a crazy person. Well, like there's UFOs, you know, and Roswell and all that stuff. But I don't know how to justify all that stuff. I don't know.
Stories, remember, it's just a story. It's passed down. People have told these things, you know. But you know, you're right. There is always, not always, but most of the time, a fragment of truth in some of these tall tales. Like the Gilgamesh, you know, there was a flood. Yes, there was a local flood, but we exaggerated on it. We told these stories as they go on. When we tell campfire stories, we exaggerate to make ourselves seem cooler or the story more cooler or whatever reason, you know. And that's how I see these things. It's just exaggerated local events.
Yeah, but what else would you expect, you know, from literature from way back then? It's what it was. It's what literature looked like. And we are post-Enlightenment. We've got the scientific method. We've got, you know, we can do all kinds of critical evaluations. Like, they didn't have that. So I think it's naive and it's presumptuous to put stuff onto the Bible, stuff that the Bible doesn't even put on itself. This is why, like, inerrancy and all these kinds of assumptions are just so foolish to me.
Well, it says that Yahweh is perfect and every word of Yahweh is perfect, and then it says that the Bible is literally the spoken words of Yahweh, the breathed out words. So, I mean, I see where they get that. I understand why they think it's inerrant and perfect.
I think the only thing that is inerrant and perfect is Jesus. And what the Bible does, the only thing the Bible does perfectly is show us how much we need Jesus. That's what it does perfectly.
Well, we're almost out of time here, but I'd like to close with one last question about worship.
All right.
Why worship? I have never felt the need to worship anything or anyone. It's a very weird concept to me. So I'm just curious why you feel such a need to worship this guy who's you can't even see him or talk to him, you know?
I love it. Yeah. Well, oh man. You're going to, what was it, Bob Dylan? Everybody's going to serve somebody. Our culture tells us that our pleasure or our power, you know, our possessions, all of these things are what we should live for. And aside from worshiping God, we're going to worship something. It might be ourselves, it might be our wealth, it might be any number of things. But worshiping God and trying to actually bring honor to this invisible deity that I get kind of tripped out on some of this sometimes. I'm like, is this all real? Like, really? You know, like, I don't know if I can get down with this. But what I can't ever get past, and the reason I can't get past in this conversation either, is most people agree that there was a guy named Jesus who lived a pretty incredible life and died a pretty brutal death. It diverges after that, you know, what people believe happened. But as far as reality and history, not a lot of people don't believe that there was ever even a guy named Jesus. So I do believe that. I do believe that there was a resurrection, and I do believe that that's the only thing that could transform what was going on in those early disciples' lives pre-resurrection to what they became post-resurrection and post-Pentecost, especially. So I can't get past that, nor can I get past the fact that if the whole world actually lived like Jesus lived, this place would be so much more delightful.
Your Jesus.
Not just the whole world.
It's your version of Jesus,
man.
though. Because the version I see is pretty mean.
Okay. Yeah. Well, let's just take the one on the cross then. And this is what I'm talking to my kids about all the time. Like, we just moved into a new area. You know, they don't have many friends, and they don't really want to be the hosts. They don't want to go pursue people. They think some of these people in Colorado are weird. And I'm like, well, look, what's a better way to live? Like, to love people, to invite them in, or to just sit back and think that they're all weird? And ultimately, it's like, I think Jesus
both.
set an example for you could, I guess. But I just think the best way to live is to give yourself, is to forgive and not hold judgment. It's to include and not to exclude. I think these are the best ways to live, and Jesus did that. And so the reason I think worship is so important, well, not just to make it anecdotal and personal, but like the first time that I lifted my hands in worship, I was probably, 19 years old. I didn't grow up in a church that did that. I didn't know anything about that. But I started reading through the Bible, and it says stuff like, lift your hands in the sanctuary and bless the Lord, or I'll praise you as long as I live, and lift up my hands. And so the first time I lifted my hands, I just felt chains start coming off of me. I saw, it was like almost out of body, saw myself and saw chains that I didn't know were binding me falling off of me. And ever since then, it's been like, wow, I think, you could definitely say that. Yeah. But it actually changed the trajectory of my life. Also, it wasn't just a moment. Like, at the time I thought it was, but when I look back, that was 22 years ago. My life's at a different place now. It took a different trajectory because of whatever happened there. It changed my future. And I still struggle, to do all kinds of stuff that I want to do. Sometimes I just want to watch what I want to watch. I don't want to watch what my wife wants to watch on TV. I want to eat what I want to eat. I don't want what she wants to eat. And at every level, I can still struggle with this stuff. But I do believe deep down, the more that I'm able to focus on something greater than myself, older than our generation, wiser than New York Times, the better it's going to make me in the long run. And I think that it draws me into a little bit more close relationship with God, which is what He's always wanted and what I desperately need.
A relationship, like a real one, I mean, how do you describe this relationship? I mean, you have a relationship with your wife. I have a relationship with my wife, and you also have a relationship with this invisible guy who doesn't talk to you. How does that work?
I don't think he's a guy.
Well,
I think he's filling all in all. I think the reason that the sunrise is so colorful is because he's making that happen. And the reason wine tastes so good is because he's filling that. Like, I don't think that he's invisible. I think he's all over the place. I don't think that all that stuff is him, but I think this is how we get to know what God is like, by looking at his works. Mary Oliver, one of my favorite poets, said, he or she who loves God will look deeply into his works. Like, I see the fingerprints of God all over the place.
Interesting.
And then I see the power of God. Like, I see the evidence, the workings of God in so many people's lives who were extremely broken and very very destructive people. When they surrender their lives to Jesus and start following Jesus, that brokenness, I mean, they're still banged up and they're still susceptible to all kinds of stuff, but they start becoming conduits of goodness, where in the past they had a wake of destruction. I've just seen too many lives changed to think this is all just smoke and mirrors.
I mean, I also have seen people get better. Mature is mostly what it is. It's maturity. You realize these things are bad for you and you just move on. I've seen people break through issues in their lives without praising and worshiping Yahweh at all. So, I mean, it's possible to do it without. You're telling me this is why you believe, this is why you do these things, but I'm telling you it can happen without it.
Yeah, I'm sure that it can, because I mean, God's gracious like that. Like there's
so it's God. It's regardless if I think it's happening without God, you're attributing it to God regardless, right?
Well, I mean, he's a father of lights, from whom, what is it? It's every good and perfect gift comes from him. So yeah, I think that every bit of goodness in this world is from him, and whether or not we acknowledge that or think that's from him, I don't think he's too aggrieved about that. But
what about
I do
the bad
think if there's goodness, it's from him. Well, I mean, I've brought plenty of bad stuff into the world by myself. Like,
well, you're not a perfect being, though. What about the bad stuff that Yahweh's created in this world?
Yeah, I mean, back to philosophy. It's been a while. I don't know that God has to be the creator of evil for evil to exist in
cancer.
Creation.
Who created cancer?
Well, I mean, not God. Like, nothing Jesus ever does would indicate that God is looking to bring viruses and death into the world.
Well, I beg to differ. So does some of the Bible verses I've read off, but but I appreciate your answers and time today. We are out of time for now. But man, this has been a blast. I really appreciate everything.
Thanks, Mike. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, man. Talk to you later. We'll keep in touch.
All right.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
And that's all the podcast there is for you today. Thanks for listening. The t-shirt giveaway is still ongoing. Once the show reaches 25 patrons, I will pick a patron at random and send them a Bible Says What t-shirt. Simply go to patreon.com/BSW the podcast and sign up to be a supporter of the show. Your episodic tithes of $1 or more will give you a chance to win prizes, gain early access to each episode, listen to unaired conversations, unlock the patron feed, and much more. Thanks to the cosmic powers of the internet, it is now possible to buy me a beer or coffee online. Simply go to buymeacoffee.com/BSW the podcast and click the appropriate buttons. If you can't support the show monetarily, please like, share, and or leave a review. As always, you can find me at the Bible Says What Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or Instagram pages. You can also reach me at bswthepodcast@gmail.com. And no matter which platform you use to listen to your podcasts, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on the next episode. Until then, would you kindly pick up your Bibles and read them?